I'm following up on the lectures that I gave in our last meeting. The intention at the last meeting had been to talk about Puteoli, but once I started looking at what was round about it, I ended up spending the entire lecture talking instead about Misenum and Baiae, further round the coast. Never actually got as far as Puteoli, which was rather a pity because I'd actually been to Puteoli, whereas I'd never been to Misenum or Baiae, the places I ended up talking about. But just to recap, to remind you of where we are and why I'm talking about these. Of course, the places that are famous on the Bay of Naples are Pompeii and Herculaneum, Stabiae a bit further down, and of course some of the villas, the very rich villas that are in the same vicinity. But what we're going to be looking at are the places that are round to the west of Naples. So here's Naples here. The ancient Naples, of course, is not much bigger than the red dot. The modern Naples sprawls out over a huge area. But instead of the cities of Vesuvius, as they're often called, I'm looking at the places round this bay here. And we looked at Misenum in the last lecture, and Baiae just to the north of it. This time we're going to be looking at Puteoli, which is there, the blue dot. So it's at the other end of the bay from Misenum. And just to remind you of the character of this region, it's a volcanic region as well, but it's also one in which land is rising and falling over the course of the centuries, so that it's changed quite considerably in the course of the last 2,000 years since the Roman period. And in particular, just to give you some idea of how significant those changes can be, between 1968 and 1972, the Campi Flegrei, that's this whole area between Misenum round to Puteoli, the area suffered an episode of positive Bradyism and rose by 1.7 metres, and then another rise of 1.8 metres occurred between 1982 and 1984. So huge changes in the land rising and falling. It's not the sea rising and falling, of course, but it's the land rising and falling, and not doing so uniformly across the area, so that one area can be fairly stable, another area falling, and vice versa at a later stage. And to remind you of where we are on this Google Earth image, there's Misenum down on the bottom there, where the Roman fleet was based, the fleet that operated from the west coast of Italy. You remember that the other Italian fleet was at Ravenna, up near Venice, at the head of the Adriatic on the other side. We also looked at Baiae there, which was one of the famous watering spots for the Roman aristocracy and for the imperial family, and it's rich in the great villas that were built there. But now we've moved round to there, to Puteoli at the far side of the bay. The themes that I want to look at, just briefly there, I'm not going to look at them all equally at equal length, but we'll have a brief overview of the history of Puteoli, then we'll look at its commercial role, the principal trade that is coming in and out of this port, the Puteoli as a business centre for traders and bankers, the international trade connections and where it's principally connected to. The answer is principally Egypt. Then we'll look at some of the resident foreign communities that were established there as traders, and became domiciled in the place. It's religiously very cosmopolitan. And then we'll look at the surviving archaeological remains. Now, some of these things are going to be intermixed. I'm not going to be looking at them in that particular order and then suddenly at the end look at the archaeological remains. It'll all come up as we move along. The surviving remains, just again, I won't be looking at them all in the same sort of depth, but just to give you some idea of the range of things that survive there that we might look at, or that you can see if you go and visit. There's the parts of the city walls, the harbour and the breakwater for the harbour, the McKellum, the marketplace. You need the volume? Yes. Sorry. That's okay. Thank goodness for Travis, who knows what he's doing here. Can you hear me still? Yeah, good. Right. It sometimes starts to echo if it's up too high. But we'll give it a try. Yeah, we've got the McKellum, which is the marketplace. We've got no less than 2 amphitheatres. There's a stadium, baths, temples, an nymphaeum, one of these ornamental fountains. an aqueduct passing the north, and then of course there's the necropolis, the cemeteries that go with the town. I should say that the reason that I wanted to talk about Puteoli is that having been to Naples in the past, you've been to Pompeii and Herculaneum, I tended to miss what was nearby in the opposite direction. Everybody who goes to Naples goes to see the famous cities of Vesuvius, but tends to overlook these places nearby. But last year we had the opportunity to visit Puteoli. So to some extent you're getting an insight into what I did in my holidays last year. Indeed, not to some extent, because the second lecture is also about what I did in my holidays last year. In terms of the history, there are very many attractive natural harbours around the Bay of Naples. Indeed, all the way up the west coast of Italy, there are a lot of natural harbours. The east coast is quite different. So in this great second phase of Greek colonisation, when Greeks were leaving their homeland, the islands and the mainland of Greece, and heading westwards looking for places to settle for better agricultural lands, it tended to be along the west coast of Italy, the southwest coast in particular, that they settled, because there were natural harbours there for people who were seafaring. Very few Greek colonies on the east side of Italy. The ancient sources are very sketchy about the settlement of Greek colonies at Puteoli. It's not entirely clear that the Greeks did originally settle it, but there are two traditions, one which said that the colonists from the Greek island of Samos established a colony there, and another tradition had it that Greek colonists who'd already established themselves at Cumae nearby, some of them subsequently settled at Puteoli, and that the city was called Dikiarchia, the city of just government. Sounds sort of slightly suspicious, but nevertheless, the name persisted right down into relatively later Roman imperial times, as we'll see in a moment. The Romans began to take an interest in the area during the war with Hannibal, the Second Punic War. That's, as you can see, 218 to 201 BC, and then in 194 they established a colony there. That meant that some of their poorer citizens, some of their discharged soldiers, were given land in this area, and they were given the title Colonia, and they had a particular status in this region. It meant that from the point of view of Rome, it was an area of security for them, that they had some of their own citizens planted there on the Bay of Naples. But they changed the name to Puteoli, meaning city of wells. Now, Puteoli then becomes important for the city of Rome, not just because it's this outpost, this colony of some of the discharged soldiers and their citizens, but because as Rome itself, the city of Rome itself, grew and had to import food on a grand scale, the natural harbour at the mouth of the Tiber at Ostia was a very poor one. The river Tiber silts up very quickly, and Ostia was a miserable harbour right through until at least the middle of the 1st century AD, and indeed into the beginning of through to the end of the 1st century AD, when artificial harbours were created there. It meant that until that time, until they created these artificial harbours, they relied on having to bring a lot of produce into places other than Ostia, and the most important place for them to do that was Puteoli, so that after Ostia itself, where some produce was brought in, Puteoli was the second most important harbour on the entire west coast of Italy. And that is reflected in the archaeological remains. I mentioned that there are 2 amphitheatres there. Something of what this meant in terms of Mediterranean-wide connections. This is the Jewish writer Josephus in his life, writing about the year AD 61 or thereabouts. He says that soon after I'd completed my 26th year, and he's domiciled in Judea, it fell to my lot to go up to Rome. I reached Rome from Caesarea on the coast of Israel after being in great jeopardy at sea, for our ship foundered in the Adriatic Sea, and our company of some 600 souls had to swim all night. About daybreak, and it tells you something about the size of the ship, that he thinks he's claiming that there were about 600 people on board. At about daybreak, we sighted a ship of Cyrene in Libya, and I and certain others, about 80 in all, outstripped the others and were taken on board, so that most of these people drowned. He says there's about 80 of them survived. And then we landed safely at Dikiarchia, that's Puteoli, which the Italians call Puteoli. So that's Josephus, telling about the journey from the coast of Israel to Puteoli in the middle of the 1st century AD. It plainly was a very dangerous enterprise, to go by sea. Sailing in the Mediterranean was difficult because the weather changing so rapidly. Most sailing was coastal, sailors making sure that they could make a run for it to the nearest harbour or shelter. But any sort of long distance travel in the Mediterranean was often very hazardous. This is the Apostle Paul, who was sent to Rome for trial in AD 59-60. His journey began in Caesarea and Palestine as well, just as had Josephus. He went north up the coast. I'll show you on a map in a moment. He went north up the coast of Israel, Lebanon, along the south coast of Turkey, between Turkey and Cyprus, and at the port of Myra on the southwest coast of Turkey, he transferred to what he called an Alexandrian vessel, so a vessel that had already come from Alexandria in Egypt, which was evidently carrying corn for Rome. The city of Rome required huge importations of corn, and the largest single source of that was Egypt. And because they couldn't land it at Ostia, they brought it into Puteoli. So this was a regular thing every year, all these great ships arriving and discharging their corn into warehouses at Puteoli. As you know, the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked off Malta and then spent the winter there. And this is what he goes on to say: 3 months had passed on Malta when we set sail in a ship which had wintered in the island with us. She was the Castor and Pollux of Alexandria. So he's already been on a ship that's come from Alexandria and they've been shipwrecked. Now, having spent the winter in Malta, another ship from Alexandria has arrived, presumably also driven off course, and that's the one that they board, and they continue on their journey ultimately to Rome. We put in at Syracuse on the northwest coast of Sicily and spent 3 days there. Then we sailed round and arrived at Rhegium on the south toe of Italy. After 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and we reached Puteoli in 2 days. There we found some brothers who invited us to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome. So the ultimate destination for Paul, although he's going to Rome, is Puteoli. From Puteoli they move on by land to Rome itself. There's the route that his ship took. It's not the one that was intended. The prevailing winds in this part of the eastern Mediterranean meant that ships sailing from Italy or Sicily could use the prevailing winds, and a mere 10 to 14 days would bring them to Alexandria in Egypt. It was relatively straightforward across the open sea. In the opposite direction, they were going against the prevailing winds, so they have to go up the coast here, and this is Paul's route. You go up the coast of Israel, Lebanon, round north of Cyprus, and he is then transferred to a different ship when he reaches Myra, then heading west again, past Rhodes, the south side of Crete, and then they get shipwrecked and he ends up in Malta for the winter. And at that point they get on yet another vessel from Alexandria, which takes them the rest of the way up to Puteoli. The next bit of text, since I've got the map up, is another one of these ships carrying grain which had gotten round as far as this, and then it's caught in storms and it's driven north into the Rhegium, and it ends up at Piraeus, the port of Athens, there. As I mentioned, the corn supply from Egypt was vital. Rome, a city with perhaps as many as 1 million people, it was imperative that the emperors made sure that the granaries were full, that they were able to supply people with food 12 months of the year. So the sailing of these vessels from Egypt reliably every year and allowing for shipwrecks and loss meant that it was a tremendous undertaking to get all this done. The ship that I mentioned that ends up in the Aegean is this one called the Isis. It had started out here, and we think this is its route along the south coast of Turkey, ending up in Piraeus up there. It should have been going that way in order to come round past Sicily and up to Puteoli, but instead it ends up going through the Aegean and in the Piraeus. The reason we're able to tell you something about that is that somebody who was resident there is this writer Lucian. In a book he called The Ship, dated about the mid-2nd century AD, he tells us about how this great corn ship, they were the supertankers of the ancient world. People normally didn't see these things except at Alexandria and at Puteoli. but in this case one's been driven by storms and ended up in the Piraeus. So he tells us that a huge boat, exceptionally large, had put into Piraeus, one of the Egyptian grain ships on its way to Italy. I fancy that you two have come from Athens for exactly the same reason to see the ship. So he, like others, streamed down from Athens to Piraeus, to look at this monster that was sitting in the harbour there. Of course, by the standards of ships today, it was modest, but by the standards of the ancient world, it was huge. Incidentally, what a huge ship, he says. 120 cubits long, so it's about 55 metres long, and well over a quarter as wide, so about 13 metres wide. And from deck to bottom, where it's deepest in the bilge, 13 metres. Then what a tall mast, what a yard to carry, what a forestay to hold it up. How gently the poop curves up, and what a little golden goose below. And correspondingly at the opposite end, the prow juts right out in front with figures of the goddess Isis, after whom the ship is named. And the other decorations, the paintings and the topsail blazing like fire, anchors in front of them, and capstans and windlasses and the cabins on the poop, all very wonderful to me. You could put the number of sailors like an army of soldiers, he says. She was said to carry corn enough to feed all of Attica, that's the territory of Athens, and its territory for a year. And all this, a little old man, a wee fellow, has kept from harm by turning the huge rudder of a tiny tiller. The captain's the little chap who stands at the back and manoeuvres the tiller. Artist's impression of what one of these ships may have looked like, because everything's out of scale. The people are not at the scale there. This is a wall painting from Ostia, the port of Rome, showing a ship which coincidentally is called the Isis as well, the Isis Gaminia. And helpfully, they've labelled some of the things, including the captain is labelled there. He's Pharnaces, he's the Magister, he's the captain. Pharnaces is a Parthian or Iranian name, so it's rather unusual to find that there. And just in case you don't know what they're carrying in the sacks on board, it's labelled Raise Corn. So there's people coming up the gangplank to pour from human-sized sacks into what's presumably a much larger vessel of some kind for the transport. So it's vital for them to have a very secure harbour, so no surprise that having decided that Puteoli is the place where the corn ships will come into, they need to protect it to make sure that it's secure as possible, even in bad weather. So you can expect at Puteoli to look for the necessary infrastructure that will go with that. For supplying the ships, the stevedores who will be necessary, as you saw in that illustration just now. Everything is done by hand. There's very little equipment available for loading and unloading ships. It's all got to be carried in sacks on people's backs. So large numbers of people would be employed on these ships. The entire bay you would expect as well to be an absolute hive of activity, especially when these corn fleets came in. These huge ships arriving, and suddenly hundreds, perhaps thousands of additional people were required to help unload them, to dock them, to prepare them for sailing back to Alexandria to bring the next year's supply coming in. So you could expect that all the way from Misenum right the way around to Puteoli, that entire bay would be buzzing with traffic. Some of it military, because there's the fleet at Misenum, a lot of it civil, large vessels, small ones, local, long distance, all of it there. We get some idea of it from this relief sculpture. This again is from Ostia, showing an impression. This is from a sarcophagus, one of these great stone coffins, showing what the inside of the harbour, a bustling harbour would look like. There we've got the lighthouse. We don't know of a lighthouse at Puteoli, but there was certainly one at Ostia, like a wedding cake in tiers leading up to the flames at the top. A ship, tremendous detail shown on the sails and the ropes. People on board it, they look as if they're offering a sacrifice. Wise thing to do before you set off to sea. And some of the things that you would find round about the harbour as well, with smaller boats buzzing around the bigger one. And there's another one from the same place, also from Ostia, showing another harbour scene, in this case with lots of little boats down here and a big one over there. Coming more directly to looking at Puteoli itself, how do we know what we know? When I went there last September, I hadn't done much homework before I set off. I knew about the place, but hadn't actually researched it very much. Wasn't even sure how we were going to get there, because I couldn't work out the trains or the buses, from Naples out to Puteoli, and we ended up walking 10 miles from Naples to Puteoli, which was actually rather pleasant, apart from near the beginning where we had to walk through a road tunnel for about a kilometre, with broken glass and bricks and so on, and cars zipping past. But otherwise, it was interesting day. And then, of course, at Puteoli, we discovered that there are actually 2 railway stations there that will take us back to Naples when we wanted it. So, written references, never had time to actually research it more fully. We've got some written references, the sort of thing I've been showing you there with from the New Testament and from Josephus. We've got the archaeological remains, the physical remains of structures themselves there. We've got some early modern drawings and paintings before the modern town, which is much, it flows out over the ancient one by a long way. But if you can go back to the 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century, you find there are a lot of drawings and paintings done, particularly by Westerners, by people from Britain and from France who went to the Bay of Naples for their holidays, and then they painted and drew what they saw around about them. So we've got quite a lot of those have survived. And then, of course, there's excavation. And we've also got these rather strange vessels, some glass bottles, which were apparently made as tourist mementos. People who are visiting the area would buy one of these things and take it back home with them. It looks as if they were intended to hold water from the healthy spas around the Bay of Naples. You'd get some of this water to take back with you. But the glass bottles themselves were very fancy. They were engraved, and it's thought that because we've got quite a number of these, or fragments of these, they're not being sort of churned out by a factory. It's almost as if they've been made individually to people's requests. Please put on X or Y or Z onto my bottle to take back with me, and be sure and label what it is I'm looking at. So that's one which is from Populonia, but shows, and we can't see the name there, it's around the other side, but it shows Baiae on the other side of the bay from Puteoli. And you can just make out it's got some names, or pilai, meaning the foundations for a breakwater. But much more useful is we've got one for Puteoli. There it is. It's been laid out flat for somebody's drawn it and interpreted what we actually see there. But this is what wrapped around one of those flasks, and it's quite complex. The name is up here, Puteoli there. Again, pilai, a reference to the breakwater, and here's a depiction of the breakwater. Temples, structures, amphitheatre, theatre, and so on. The person who drew this out has helpfully also disentangled all the writing, and here's a translation of it. So it says on it, "Fortunate one, drink," an additional reason for believing that the water in it was intended to be something, if you're feeling a little bit off colour, you could have some of this water to drink. Drink so you may live happily with your loved ones. And then it goes on to give us the names of the things that are depicted there. A stadium, sundial, Lares, paved streets behind the forum, shrine of Isis, Puteoli itself is named, breakwater, open sea, amphitheatre, theatre, region of the 13 gods, Hordionian region, Palastra, imperial shrine, Numisian region, Hortensian quay, way stations, steps of God. With a few more of these, we can probably build up a very clear picture of the range of public buildings that people would have seen there in antiquity, many of which have long since disappeared, or which there are only fragments surviving. So that's one source of evidence. Another source of evidence, grain storage. Well, we would expect with all these huge ships arriving and having to disgorge the cargo there to be stored there for a time before it's shipped up to Rome or taken by land up to Rome, you'd expect there to be huge granaries. Roman granaries tend to stand out because they're massive buildings to provide secure storage and dry storage for grain. In practice, we don't have any physical evidence for a single granary there. Now, that may be because the sea has changed, the coast has changed at that point, and we know that there are a number of buildings are now under the sea off the coast. So it's quite possible that there were granaries, but they're flooded. What we do have is some written evidence. Road works being undertaken east of Pompeii, around the other side of the bay, uncovered a villa in which were 70 wax writing tablets. Now, you've probably seen these things, a wooden tablet on which there's wax, and people with a sharp instrument would write straight into the wax. 70 of those so-called Muricine tablets were excavated when this villa was uncovered during roadworks some years ago, 1959. Some of the wax tablets are contracts from the year AD 37, and one of them, I've just given you a little bit of it there, one of them says 7,000 modi, more or less, of Alexandrian wheat, and 4,000 modi, more or less, of chickpeas, emmer, and lentils in 200 sacks, all of which I have in deposit under my name in the public warehouse, the Horia Bassiana at Puteoli. So even though we haven't got the physical remains of a granary, this document from AD 37, a contract, tells us that the person who's a party at the contract says that he was storing 7,000 modi of grain in the Horia Bassiana, the granary Bassiana. 7,000 modi is about 45 tons. So it gives you some idea of the scale of it. One person has that amount on deposit now. The breakwater that ships were coming into, this is one of the numerous paintings and drawings that were done in the 1700s and 1800s. Just the rump of the breakwater surviving. Somebody had built a little house on part of one of it, but most of it was still visible, and that's in 1840. That's what it looked like in a painting of 1776, somebody much further up the hill looking down towards it. There's the remains of the breakwater there. Originally, of course, there was a roadway across the top, and this is all arched across it. But the other thing to note while we're still here is that the artist has included the so-called Temple of Serapis there. He's looking down over it. It's not actually a temple at all, as we'll see in a moment. It's a marketplace. And a French archaeologist has done this helpful artist's impression. You mustn't take it too literally. It's some of the buildings are ones that you can identify. Others, of course, are purely conjectural. But here's the breakwater there. He's helpfully put in a granary down here. This is this huge building here, and all the way around the bay, round past Lake Avernus, where Baiae is there, and right the way down to Misenum. So it's a substantial, bustling little town. Now I want to look at some of these structures. I've marked them on this image from Google Earth. The core of the town is here. This is relatively high ground. This is probably where, if there was a Greek colony there, it would have been on this rocky outcrop looking down over the breakwater. The modern breakwater runs over the top of the Roman one. So the traces of what you saw in those artist paintings and drawings a moment ago, that has been incorporated into the modern breakwater. So the core of the ancient town is there, and then a whole series of structures appeared over the course of the Roman period as the town grew out from there in both directions up into the hills over there. So we've got, you see there's an amphitheatre there, and then there's another one marked there. Temple of Diana, which is actually not a temple at all, but it's an Amphion, a huge ornamental fountain. There's a Temple of Neptune, in this case not a temple either, it's a bath building. So many structures that were named in the 18th and 19th century by people who saw anything that was large. It's a temple of some kind or other, and we now know that there's no such thing. Also underwater remains down here. And there's the breakwater. What we have, the next slide is an enlargement of that area. Can you make out these? These are pili, presumably indicating that the coast came considerably further out in Roman times. And there's a lot of buildings submerged there. And now turning to the various structures on land. This is the building that I pointed to in that artist's impression of 1776, the one that was labelled the Temple of Serapis. Now we know, in fact, it's a macellum, it's a market building. That is in the middle, and here are the offices of the market running around at least 3 and probably 4 sides. It rained briefly just as we arrived. The thing to note is these 3 columns here and the marks on the middle of each of the 3 of them, because that marks where the depth to which this building was submerged at some time in the past. Mollusks eat away, bore into the marble, and that's what you've got there is the marble that's been eaten away by mollusks. So at some stage this building, it's not that the sea was higher, but the land was lower, and it's arisen again since Roman times, that the water was up that high at some stage in the past. If that's correct, then the top of where the mollusks have been boring into the marble today is about 7 meters above the current sea level in the bay nearby. And there's those 3 columns there. You can see how they've been eaten away, bored away by the mollusks. So we're looking out in the opposite direction now, out towards the sea. Just while we've got the Macellum on, because it's a place they've been bustling on market day in particular, provision was made by providing a latrine here, and there's a corresponding one in the other corner as well, presumably ladies and gents. And it's a famous scene, to the extent that one of the local restaurants has adopted an artist's impression of it as their sign outside to entice you to come in and eat there. Can you still hear me? Is the microphone still loud enough? Turning to the amphitheatres next, this is what it looked like in an aerial photograph of 40, 50 years ago. The main amphitheatre, very straightforward. I think it's the 2nd or the 3rd largest in Italy after the Colosseum. It's huge, and it's very well preserved. And if you've got to choose between going around the Colosseum and you're queuing for an hour to get in, then shuffling around with 1,000 other people, forget it. Go to Puteoli and wander around here. On the day we visited, there were only 2 other people inside, and it's pretty well preserved, and it's really very impressive. But the other feature here is the second one, fragments of which you can just make out there. This line there is where the railway was about to come through. And of course the town today expands well beyond these. This is what it looks like in a vertical image on Google Earth. There's the main amphitheatre there, that's that one. But there's another one up here with the railway and the station cutting right the way through it, so that it's almost entirely disappeared. There's nothing to see. But it was approximately there. So there were 2 amphitheatres, not simultaneously. It looks like the smaller one made way for this one once it was constructed. You wouldn't have needed 2 in operation simultaneously. It's an impressive amphitheatre, as you can see, very well preserved. And most of it is brick-faced concrete, so it's a concrete core, a brick facing, but in a lot of places you've got masonry of this sort all the way around. Probably marble cladding in places, cheap marble cladding in places as well. A lot of architectural pieces lying around still, so that it would have been in the middle of sort of piazza, with shady areas for people to lounge in before they went in, to watch whatever gaudy spectacle was going on inside the amphitheatre. To get inside, one of the sets of stairs going up. These ones would go right up to the topmost seats. There's other ones that go up to seats halfway up. So you've got steep flights of stairs all the way around, taking you up to the top seats, and then less steep ones taking you up to the internal seats. View inside, and those stairs would bring you out at openings like this, so you could get access to the top seats, and then lesser staircases would bring you out to these openings here for the lower seats. The Colosseum, famously, of course, has got structures underneath the arena. There are all sorts of rooms that are there for storage, for keeping beasts, all sorts of equipment for bringing things up into the arena when it was required. Normally, you can't see any of that today. It's not open to tourists. Here at Puteoli, it is. You can simply wander down the staircase there, which will bring you out underneath the entire arena and indeed underneath the seats, where there's a huge area of corridors Most of these columns were in there when excavations started back in the 18th and 19th century. It's not clear why it was there, but it looks as if somebody had actually salvaged these things and taken them down and stored them in these corridors underneath. This is the central corridor, so it's nice and straight. But then you've got corridors running all the way around with these massive column drums lying there as well. So there's a whole range of rooms for storage and for keeping presumably gladiators or animals before they were actually introduced into the arena. So, well worth a visit. There's a stadium as well, as you'd expect. This is what it looks like on Google Earth. Not a great deal standing out there, but it has been excavated in recent years. The artist's impression of what it may have looked like originally, very impressive building again. What is actually there is what you see here. That's the inside. This is the, let's just go back one. That is that. And you've got the corridors running all the way around underneath the seats inside. A lot of it is underneath a road and houses now, so these fragments that you see in these photographs are virtually all that is likely to be visible for some time to come. But in addition to having an amphitheatre replaced by an even bigger amphitheatre, they had a stadium. The Baths of Neptune, originally thought of as a temple, but it's not, it's a bath building. Again, brick-faced concrete, huge structure. This is just a fragment of what has survived, but it's a huge structure that was there once. Just to give you an idea of the sheer bulk of these things. Not on the same scale as the great imperial baths in Rome itself, but nevertheless extremely impressive for a relatively small Italian town. The Temple of Augustus is now the Duomo, the cathedral. That's what it looks like. Much of the temple has survived. This is what it looks like from the outside and from the inside, where of course it's a church today. So the Temple of Augustus, very well preserved. No great surprise that there should be a temple of the reigning emperor there. Water supply, we've got the aqueduct, the Sereno aqueduct, comes around from the other side of the Bay of Naples, passes to the north of Puteoli, and the twin channel still survives there, cut by a road. What about the people who lived in Puteoli? Because it's a great trading centre, Ostia seems to have been mainly focused on the Western Mediterranean, to the south of France, Spain, North Africa. Puteoli dealt with the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's reflected in the ethnic groups that you encounter at Puteoli. We've got references to there being communities there of Jews, Syrians, and Syrians from different cities in Syria, from Tyre, Damascus, Beirut, Heliopolis. Egyptians, of course, as you might expect, with the grain supply coming in from Alexandria each year, and less to be expected Nabateans, from the Nabatean kingdom with its capital at Petra in what's now Jordan. Jews, because the most obvious evidence for that is the piece that we looked at right at the beginning of the lecture, the Apostle Paul arriving there saying that we found some brothers there, just as at Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, all these other places that Paul had stayed. He goes and stays with some of the Jewish community in these places, so he evidently found a Jewish community in Puteoli as well. Syrians, we got a letter which was then chiselled up on a stone. I've just given you the beginning of it. It's a letter, this is a direct quotation from the letter as it appears on the stone. Letter written to the city of Tyre, so this is Tyre on the coast of what's now the Lebanon, the sacred, inviolable and autonomous metropolis of Phoenicia and of other cities and mistress of a fleet. Most of this is untrue by this stage, but they're flattering you, the city of Tyre. And the letter goes on, to the chief magistrates of Tyre, council and people of their sovereign native city from the Tyrians who are resident in Puteoli. So this is Tyrians who live in Puteoli who are writing back to the council and people of Tyre in the Lebanon. They've gone to all this length because they just about asked them for some money. Sort of saying, remember us, we're the descendants of colonists from the mother city of Tyre, and we're a little bit short, can you help? To their credit, they tacked on at the bottom of the letter, which goes on at greater length, the reply from the city of Tyre saying no, saying that the Tyrians who live in Rome are supposed to supplement your income. You ask them. And then we've got a contract from Pompey. One of the documents survived there. This is one's between a banker in Puteoli and a Tyrian. And there's what it says, commitment to appear made by Zenon the Tyrian, freedman of Zenobus for the third day, blah, blah, blah. So a contract from a banker at Puteoli dealing with a man from Tyre. Egyptians, we assume there was a lot of Egyptians there, are not as prominent as you might expect. We assumed that with the corn fleets coming in from Alexandria every year, year after year, decade after decade, that there would have been a huge Egyptian population there, and quite possibly there was. But the principal evidence for it is in the shape of Egyptian temples. Now, they were popular all over the empire, so the fact that you have a temple of Serapis as early as 105 BC doesn't necessarily mean there was a large Egyptian community there. It was just popular about that stage with Romans more widely. Serapis is in one personification is a protector of merchants and mariners, so again, it's not surprising. As we saw on that last vessel earlier, one of the places that is actually labelled and depicted there is a shrine of Isis, again, an Egyptian deity. And then we've got another of these documents from Pompey, this time telling us that the contract has partly been made with a man called Trypho the Alexandrian, son of Potamon, from blah, blah, blah. So a contract with somebody from Alexandria. But otherwise, the evidence for Egyptians in Puteoli is relatively modest, surprisingly modest. Nabateans, the evidence for this is much better. Now, just to remind you, the Nabatean kingdom is very substantial. Petra, the capital, is there. I probably don't need to explain to this audience, Petra with its wonderful tombs and so on. Petra, the capital, is there. The kingdom itself stretches right up into southern Syria, up to just south of Damascus. But it also extended down through the Sinai and down the coast into what is now northwest Saudi Arabia over here. So it was actually rather large and right out into the desert as far as Dumat al-Jandal. Until 106 AD, it was an independent kingdom. It was only at that year that it was annexed and became a Roman province, the province of Arabia. So why would you expect to find Nabateans at Puteoli, mainly in the 1st century BC, in the very early part of the 1st century AD, where you're 100 years before you'd expect them? They're nevertheless very prominent. Puteoli up there, Petra's here. It's not very clear on the map there, because the eastern Mediterranean and the trade routes. Now, the Nabateans were great traders, but they were middlemen. They were not themselves, they themselves did not have much that was worth trading, but they were people who undertook to act as middlemen for other people. So they were responsible for importing precious spices, frankincense, myrrh, spices from the Yemen up through the Red Sea, by land or sea, into the Mediterranean, and then shipping it out around the Mediterranean to where there were the great cities and people who wanted to buy it. But nonetheless, they are still just middlemen. Leaving aside Nabatean inscriptions that you find in that region itself, in Jordan and neighbouring Israel, there are 21 inscriptions found around the Mediterranean attesting to Nabateans in places outside their heartlands. 6 of them are in the Aegean, various places around the Aegean. 2 are at Rome. Can't remember where the next one is, but 12 of the other 21 are from Puteoli. So more than half of all of the inscriptions we've got for Nabateans in the eastern Mediterranean come from Puteoli. 2 of those are in Nabatean, one's in Greek, and 9 are in Latin. And just to remind you what I said a moment ago, that they're middlemen. So it has come as a bit of a surprise to find that there appears to have been a fairly substantial community of Nabateans at Puteoli. If they're just middlemen, why do they need to have a community there? Why are they not just shipping and handing it over to somebody else? Of the inscriptions, of those 12 inscriptions, one of them gives us the name of the individual. He's called Ptolemaeus, and he's said to be from Petra, but because he's got a name that presumably the locals couldn't get their tongues round, he's known to the locals as Maximus, sort of colourless Roman name. So instead of being called Ptolemaeus, the locals all knew him as Maximus. Second inscription is for a sanctuary, originally built in 5049 BC by somebody with a good Nabatean name there. The inscription's in Nabatean as well, and then it was repaired in 2 BC. Then we got one from 11 AD, in which we get a dedication being made of 2 camels. I just wonder how common camels were around Puteoli, but in this case, in Nabatean, the dedicant is offering a sacrifice of 2 camels. Most of the other inscriptions are like this. They're very simple, nicely cut, and they either simply say Dusari, you're to the god Dusharis, or Dusari Sacrum, as on this one here. The thing to note is that they've all got these slots on the top, in which it's thought that there were vertical slabs of stone, a feature of Nabatean religion, that you have these standing stones that you would set up, in this case set up on the top of this would be viewed as a sort of altar. 6 of these 12 stones were found in the sea, and it's thought that the building that they came from is now flooded. It's off the coast, with the change in coastline now. So probably a temple that the Nabateans built there, quite an impressive one, but no longer visible, probably under the sea. And just to finish off the last 2 or 3 minutes, we've got a lot of inscriptions from Puteoli attesting to families there who were engaged in banking or trading or both of those things. One such family at Puteoli is the family of the Anii. In other words, it's people whose family name was Anius. Several inscriptions from Puteoli to people with that name imply that the people themselves are probably originally Greek slaves who've been freed, given Roman citizenship, so they've changed the name to the name of the master who's just freed them. So presumably somebody called Publius Annius or Marcus Annius has had a slave whom he's freed, and then the slave, as was common in Roman tradition, you took the name of your erstwhile master. So if your master was called Marcus Annius, something or other, and your name is Polybius, you change your name to Marcus Annius Polybius. You keep your Greek name, but you add the 2 Roman names in front. So we've got a number of Roman named people there who appear to be of Greek origin, such as the ones I've given you at the bottom there. Somebody called Publius Annius Seleucus, and another one called Publius Annius Eros, both of whom have Greek names, but have evidently been freed by a Roman with the name Publius Annius. Another one appears, the Publius Annius Eros, we get his name from this inscription here. It's set up to a group of people, all of whom are former slaves. They're all freedmen. Now, the Roman society was very strange. Slaves, of course, are often treated absolutely abominably. They're simply chattels. But when they were freed, they took the status of their erstwhile master. So if your master was a Roman citizen, you went from being a slave to being a Roman citizen yourself. You would have to describe yourself as a freedman, not a free man, but a freedman. But in the next generation, that didn't matter anymore. You yourself, you still had the slight stigma of being a freedman, but you were a Roman citizen now. In the next generation, your children and grandchildren and so on, they would simply be Roman citizens. Here's Marcus. Where is he? The bit we're interested in is right at the bottom there, where we're told that it's not spelled out fully. There's his name, Eros, Eroti, in the dedication, but he's being described as the freedman of the name in front. So if we spelt it all out, he would be Publius Annius Eros, freedman of Publius Anius Plakamus. There's Plakamus' name there. Now the reason that's important is because we have heard of Plakamus before. This is the Roman writer Pliny, the man who was killed at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius when he took his fleet ships across the bay to try and rescue people when Vesuvius erupted, but he ended up dying himself. Fortunately, he'd already written his great natural history, and we've got that almost in entirety. And this is what he says: "Thus far is known by the ancient writers. We, however, gained greater knowledge when during the principate of Claudius, in other words, in the period sort of 40, early 50s, an embassy actually came from that island." And he's talking about what we can identify as Sri Lanka. So he's saying that an embassy came to the Emperor Claudius in the middle of the 1st century AD. And he says the reason that that happened, that they sent an embassy, was this. He said it came about in this way. A freedman of Anius Plakamus, the man who's named on that previous inscription, who had gained a contract for the Red Sea tax from the treasury, while sailing round Arabia, was carried by the north wind past Carmania, and on the 15th day made the port of Epirus there, i.e. in Sri Lanka. So, in other words, a man called Anius Plakamus, who's named on the inscription from Puteoli, had won a contract to collect the taxes in the Red Sea. This is presumably sort of your taxes on goods in the Red Sea. And that we're told that while one of his freedmen was doing it, he himself doesn't do it. He bids for the contract, he gets it, and then he sends his freedmen out to Egypt, to the Red Sea, to actually do the work on his behalf. So this man is out there, and while this man is out there collecting the taxes for him, he's carried off by bad weather in the Red Sea out into the Arabian Sea, and the wind drives him along the south coast of what's Iran, but he eventually fetches up on what turns out to be Sri Lanka. So here we've got Anius Plakamus, who lives in Puteoli. He himself is probably originally of slave stock, but he himself now owns slaves, and he's freed some of them. He has his own freedmen. One of them, at least, has been sent out to the coast of Egypt, near Berenike on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, with the job of collecting the taxes there. Now, we've got another piece of information coming from the coast of the Red Sea near Berenike. I've never been able to pin down precisely where it is. The description in the publication is very vague. But there's the inscription. There's a number of them all together. And of course they stand out because unlike the native ones, these are in Greek or Latin. The relevant bits are there. You can perhaps just make out, I think the letters are up there. Lysis, freedman of Publius Anius Plakamus, so there's another freedman with a different name of Anius Plakamus, came here on the 5th of July, and he doesn't give the year, he's forgotten to put the year. However, the same man says more or less the same thing, but in Greek just nearby, and this time he does put the year on, it's the year AD 6. So it's long before Claudius's time, but on the face of it, we've got another freedman of Anius Plakamus, whose family originated in Puteoli. Here he is on the coast of the Red Sea near Berenike. Now at that point, this was all very interesting, but as a result of the work I've been doing in Saudi Arabia recently, we can add a final strand to it. Here's the Red Sea coast. Berenike is down here. It doesn't appear on this map, but it's down here somewhere. So that inscription I've just been showing you for that man, this freedman Lysis, came from there. But we've now got where we've been working in Saudi Arabia at Al Ula. The Nabatean city of Hegra is there. It's a sort of mini Petra. And a year or so back, I met a British geologist who'd worked in this area 30 years ago. And he said, oh, I've got a photograph of a Latin inscription that I took the photograph in that area 25, 30 years ago. Fortunately, he still has the photograph. There it is. Not as nicely cut as the one that we saw from Egypt, but there's what it says. 4 days before the Ides of November, so there's an M missing from it. And look at the man's name. Not Plakamus this time, but another member of this family, another Anius. So it looks like, in addition to the freedmen operating on the behalf of Anius Plakamus on the west coast of the Red Sea down here, down towards Berenike, there were others on the far side operating down through Saudi Arabia, through the Hegra on this side. Unfortunately, although it gives us the precise date, the 10th of November, it doesn't tell us what year it is. And at that point, we can all go and have some tea, and then we'll come back to looking at some other Italian cities afterwards. Thank you.